When you get a diabetes diagnosis, you have a lot to think about and keep track of. Your supply company should help lighten your load, not add to it. That's why I'm so happy to talk about US Med. They hold an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau, so you know they excel in customer satisfaction. US Med always ensures you have 90 days worth of supplies and provides fast, free shipping to your doorstep. It's great to know you don't have to constantly run to the pharmacy or think about ordering every week. US Med, your trusted partner in diabetes care. Your health, satisfaction, and peace of mind are their priority. Better service, better care. Learn more, go to usmed.com/Stacey. That's usmed.com/STACEY. Today on Diabetes Connections Type 2, medications like Ozempic and Mounjaro have fundamentally changed the way diabetes is treated. But even if your doctor writes the prescription and your insurance company covers it, getting your hands on that medication is getting harder and harder. We're talking about what to do if you're having trouble here, tips if you have to stop and then start again, and some questions you might bring to your doctor to help you get a better chance of actually getting your hands on these injections. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Hello and welcome to Diabetes Connections Type 2. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and for many years I have hosted a show all about Type 1 and people who use insulin. And for a long time I've been thinking we need something like that for the Type 2 community. So I started this podcast and I am just thrilled with how it is going. I'm hearing from so many people that they're getting information that they can bring to their doctors. And, we're not here to nag you or anything like that, because if you live with type 2 or prediabetes, I am sure you get an earful from your doctor, from your family, who means very well, from your neighbors, from your friends. Everybody has something to say about diabetes for some reason. My husband lives with type 2. My son lives with type 1. I do not have diabetes, but I have a background in broadcasting. And so that is why I got into podcasting. Big thank you to everybody who reached out and replied to my request about what to cover at the ADA Scientific Sessions Conference. As you're listening, I am just back from there. You're going to be hearing more of the big stories from this very big, perhaps the biggest diabetes conference in the United States. And I'm taping this episode before I go to ADA, but I know GLP-1s, semaglutide, going to be top of the conversation there. The research is great, and I'm sure there will be more of it at that conference, but everybody I know who is taking these medications is having a very hard time finding them. And that includes my editor, John Buchanan, who reached out a couple of weeks ago and asked me to do this episode. Right now, there is still such a shortage of this medication that companies have popped up with trackers to help you find them. There's a telehealth company called Ro, just R-O. I will link up their information in the show notes. Novo Nordisk, which makes Ozempic, Eli Lilly, which makes Mounjaro, have both said that this shortage will continue through the summer. I put out a newscast every other week on this podcast feed, so I will definitely keep you up to date on what's going on, announcements from the FDA, and if there's any change in the supply of either of these medications. Okay, my guest is Dr. Michael Weintraub. He is an endocrinologist and a diabetologist at NYU. He is a researcher and he also sees patients, so he is dealing with this almost every day. There is some presumed knowledge about GLP-1s and semaglutides in this episode. If this is your first time finding us, welcome. I'm going to link up the deep dive we did last year about how these medications work, how long they've been around, that may surprise you, and why they have jumped into such high use more recently. For today's episode, I think all you really need to know is that we are talking about Ozempic and Mounjaro. Ozempic is the brand name for semaglutide. Mounjaro is the brand name for tirzepatide. They are both GLP-1 receptor agonist medications, which means they activate a specific gut hormone. Mounjaro stimulates a second hormone. That is a very simple explanation. Dr. Weintraub will tell us a lot more right after this. Dr. Michael Weintraub, thanks so much for being here. Important topic today. I hope you can help us out. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You got it. Why don't we just start off, if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about yourself and about your practice and the patients that you see.
Certainly. I am an endocrinologist and diabetologist at New York University. So I am part of the academic program there, as well as part of the research program. So I regularly see patients with type 2 diabetes, with various complications of type 2 diabetes, as well as with obesity and other endocrine disorders. So I see a number of different types of conditions.
These medications have been out for a very long time, actually, not quite in the form that they are now. I'd love to know, when did things really start to change for you as you started prescribing, medications like Ozempic to your patients?
Yeah, certainly. So as you pointed out, they're certainly not brand new. We've had this class of medicines for going on 20 years now, really starting, in the last several years with the approval of semaglutide for type 2 diabetes. We really have started seeing the remarkable effect of these class of medications, not only in terms of their glucose lowering, but also their protective effect on many other organ systems and many other potential complications of type 2 diabetes. So it seems like every single week there's a new trial that came out showing a benefit of these medications in a particular, different organ system or disease state.
And I should point out, we've done previous episodes on why it was more recent, how they've been around for so long. So as you're listening, if you'd like to do more of a deep dive into how we got here, you can definitely go back. But it really is remarkable. I mean, everywhere you look now, the marketing is there. People are talking about it. It's incredible. I would imagine that not a day goes by in your practice when someone isn't coming in and asking you about it.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with the approval of these a version of these medications for obesity. Certainly the surge in demand is remarkable.
We're going to get to the supply issues and what you can do very quickly. But I'd love for you to take a moment and walk me through the process with your type 2 patients. I imagine people have a lot of questions. I imagine at this point you have kind of a routine that you walk them through. How do you go from walking into your doctor's office to leaving with a prescription and I use the brand names just because I think it's easier, but please feel free to use the brands you're using. But, somebody comes in and says, I want this. How do you get them from that to being educated enough to getting the Ozempic or the Mounjaro?
Yeah, certainly. So, the first step is really taking a good history and really understanding where the patient is coming from. How long have they had type 2 diabetes? How long have they had weight gain or obesity? What degree of complications do they already have from their type 2 diabetes? What severity is it? How much of a glucose lowering effect do we need from many of these different medications? So it's really really getting a full understanding of the patient and their history to really understand, well, what is the best approach for that particular person?
So if only it were this easy, right? Then you give them a prescription, they take it to the pharmacy, they do mail order, they get it delivered, insurance pays for it, and everybody's on their merry way. Obviously, that is not happening, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to talk to you. What's going on right now? And this, as we are speaking, this will be mid to late June of 2024, where it just seems like really hard to get this stuff.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we touched a little bit upon the tremendous beneficial effects, not only at glucose lowering, kidney protection, heart disease, stroke prevention, heart failure prevention. There's so many remarkable benefits of these types of medications, and people know about it. And so in many ways, I'm glad that people are coming to my office and asking me for a medication that they know can benefit them in so many different ways. But the other side of the coin is that in any other, endocrine type condition that I've treated, has there been, an issue with obtaining the medication at the pharmacy when it comes to supply issues? So this is such a unique problem. Some ways, great that we have such effective medications, but yeah, it can be so challenging for a patient to not only obtain a new prescription, but also continue the treatment that they're already on.
So knowing how difficult it is, what are you telling patients? And I imagine you've got patients coming in saying, I've been on a semaglutide for 6 months, for 2 years, and now I can't get it. What the heck do I do? What do you tell them?
Yeah. So certainly we have to, the situation changes seemingly every week, and we do have to get creative in terms of what strategies us as the patient, as well as the provider, should have to really continue to attain adequate glucose control, as well as the protection of all those other important, from all those other important potential complications. So really the first step is, knowing, okay, what are we taking and what are we able to take? if a patient is on a particular dose of a particular medication within that GLP-1 or GLP-1 GIP class, their particular pharmacy, whether or not they have it. And really the first step is seeing if not only their current pharmacy, but what about other pharmacies? What about neighboring brick and mortar pharmacies? What about mail order pharmacies? Really calling up and seeing, do they have a supply of that particular medication at that particular dose? Because supply really changes on a daily basis, and it's in an unpredictable fashion in terms of when a pharmacy is going to get a particular, restocking of that particular medication. So I think that's the first step, in a multi-tiered strategy. That is kind of the first step in plan of attack in terms of trying to get, our particular medication that we know we can tolerate and is effective for us.
All right. Then you find out, you know what? I can't get it. I'm running out. I got 2 days left, or I got no days left. I worry about stopping cold turkey, right? Like, what do you do?
So the next step is, really not only looking for that particular dose that we're on, but what about a dose above or a dose below that particular medication? For example, say we are taking Mounjaro 10 milligrams once a week. If the 10 milligram dose isn't available, well, what about the 12.5 milligram dose? What about the 7.5 milligram dose? Is there a pharmacy that has that particular supply? So a dose above and a dose below, I think, is okay. Further lowering, then we run the risk of, well, are we going to get not adequate glucose control? Too high of a jump of dose, could that trigger any gastrointestinal side effects upon increasing to a new level? So that's kind of the next tier of seeing if at least within that specific medication, can we get another neighboring dose?
You know where I'm going, though. If they cannot get the medication, what do you do? I mean, do you go to a different type of medication? Do you go to one of the older brands of this? And then we'll talk about when you can't get anything at all.
Right. Yeah. So what's the next tier? Our next step. So then it's, looking at within that same class, is there another medication within that class that we know has comparable effectiveness? Now, we don't have many direct head-to-head trials within this class, but we do have, data in terms of what's the, relative effectiveness. And we can use that as an approximation of, okay, if someone is taking Mounjaro 10 milligrams and they can't attain it, well, what about if we go to and reach towards Ozempic? Is Ozempic in supply? Could we switch to a comparable dose, which roughly it's probably the highest dose of Ozempic, which is the 2 milligram pen. So do one of the pharmacies have a 2 milligram pen of Ozempic available that at least we can switch to for the time being? And then it further goes back. I mean, we have kind of relative effectiveness of, well, what about dulaglutide or the brand name Trulicity? What about the daily liraglutide, Victoza, Saxenda? So we have rough abilities to roughly equate what might be the general effectiveness. That being said, every patient is different. So someone may develop side effects on one versus another. So we have to make sure that we take this with a grain of salt and with caution, and really working with our provider to know, well, what is the safest next step.
Yeah, and knowing that whatever we say in this podcast, you have to talk to your doctor. You said several times how individualized this is. But it sounds like it's better to try to talk to your doctor about switching to, you've mentioned a couple of brand names, Trulicity, Saxenda, to get one of those rather than taking nothing in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, then it comes to, well, what are we taking this medication for? Is it pure, glucose control, and we really have rather severe hyperglycemia, and we've tried other medications, and this has really been the unique effective medication? Well, then yes, taking a medication within that class would be very helpful. And if we're not able to attain that, then thinking about, well, what about other classes of medications for that, glucose lowering, especially in the short term, to prevent any complications from severe hyperglycemia.
So just to bring an example into this, and I think this will sound familiar to so many people, my husband lives with type 2. He started just taking Ozempic, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago. It did okay for his A1C, and that's really why he was taking it. And then his doctor switched him to Mounjaro, much better. He didn't really lose a lot of weight. He doesn't have a lot of weight to lose, but he didn't see that benefit. But the A1C, man, that was fabulous. And then, of course, we're having all these problems getting it. And we're really active and involved. And we're calling pharmacies, and he's online, and we're checking Amazon. And then his doctor suggested that maybe the easiest way to get this is to loop it in for weight loss. So he rewrote the prescription for the brand name Zepbound, which is, tirzepatide, Mounjaro for weight loss. And my husband was able to find the supply, but our insurance wouldn't cover it. So we had to make the decision, what do we do? And you know what? We sat down and really hashed it out because I'm not going to give you his whole health history. We just felt that it was much more important for him to maintain glucose control. And we would pay out of pocket for a couple of months. And we kind of set a deadline. And now we've hit that deadline and we can't keep paying it every month. So he's switched to Ozempic and we'll see what happens. But I got to tell you, but maybe we'll talk about this towards the end of the interview when we get through this practical part. I'm mad. But I would assume that a lot of that sounds familiar to you. But the changing for weight loss, Ozempic to Wegovy, Mounjaro to Zepbound, have you had success with any of your patients getting insurance coverage for that?
So yeah, the reason I didn't introduce that as an approach is because it is very rare for that to really be a successful strategy for two reasons. One is what you mentioned, the coverage issue, where it is increasingly, a lot of these insurance plans are just flat out having plan exclusions for any obesity pharmacotherapy, flat out. That's why, in some ways, if someone comes in with obesity and then they have an A1C of 6.5%, well, in some ways that's, now we have access to all these medications because they have a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. If they came in with an A1C of 6.4%, well, then we're out of luck in terms of having this class of medications as an option. So that's one issue is insurance coverage. And the other is, on average, there has been more shortages of the medications for obesity, the Zepbound and the Wegovy, than there has been for type 2 diabetes medications. So that's another reason why this hasn't been as a successful strategy as I would have hoped.
I know we really thought we had something there, but no. I am bombarded daily, and maybe it shows you what I'm following on social media, but I get a bajillion ads for compounds of this stuff. And I know that there have been some warnings about that. But let me ask you, when people say compounded semaglutide or we're a med spa and we have semaglutide, is this stuff safe? Do we know what's in it?
So yeah, compounded medications, compounded semaglutide, I have a major hesitation with using these medications or prescribing these medications, mainly because of the unknown, the lack of regulatory oversight to really know what is my patient getting. Number one, we want to do no harm. And a lot of these, I'm not as familiar with compounding pharmacies to know, okay, which one is a well-established, reputable pharmacy versus the ones that seemingly have been invented overnight and are manufacturing these compounded medications. And, we lack the data of, how good are these medications. But, some studies are showing that the concentration of the medication is not what's advertised. There can be impurities in it. There have been, potential issues in terms of safety concerns with these medications. So that's the reason why I'd rather utilize a medication that I know is being, manufactured by a pharmaceutical company that is being overseen by the FDA, and switching to another class of medications that at least I know what it is, than utilizing these compounding medications.
Yeah. One thing we should ask about too is if you go off of these medications and then you're able to get them back, any advice? Because I imagine you don't want to start in the same exact dose, or maybe you do.
Yes, 100%. So this, I think, is very important, both from the provider level as well as the patient, to know what we should do when we suddenly get a supply again. So, these medications, they're taken once a week. What happens if we can't get them for 2 weeks? Well, most likely, if we're not able to get the medication for 2 weeks, we can probably restart that same dose and not have develop any side effects. Really, the thing that we worry about is if we go from not having a high drug concentration in our body to suddenly having a much higher dose than we had before. That's when we can trigger gastrointestinal side effects, nausea, vomiting, constipation, diarrhea. And so that's what we always have to consider, when we're thinking about restarting that medication. So if it's within 2 weeks, if we didn't have any gastrointestinal side effects to begin with, when we started the medication, we maybe just had mild nausea at best, and that went away. Then not having a 2 week period or 2 week break, it's probably fine. But then when we get to 3 weeks without a dose, especially if we've had some nausea or even vomiting in the beginning when we started the medication, then I get concerned that if we restarted the medication at that same dose, then that's going to trigger gastrointestinal side effects. So under those circumstances, we should restart at a lower dose and then restart that dose of titration because this is really a marathon, not a sprint when it comes to making sure that we get adequate glucose and weight control.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. We're watching closely what these pharmaceutical companies are saying about when these shortages will ease. And I don't want to sound cynical, Dr. Weintraub, but I don't believe anything they say. I've been doing a diabetes podcast for 9 years. And I feel like, the insulin pricing issue that whenever we talked about it, we never got a straight answer from these companies. So I don't really expect one here. It's not fair for me to put that on you. I'd love to know what you think is going to happen here. And I don't even want to ask you why. That's not fair to you. Let me just ask you, what do you think is going to happen here? Will we see some relief from this soon? There's so much money to be made in this. I can't imagine they're not trying to work around the clock.
I agree. I don't know. I really don't know what this outcome is going to be. I mean, I think in the short term, I think is a big question mark. In the medium term, long term, I am rather optimistic. Some of these medications are going off patent, so hopefully there'll be a generic or biosimilar version of these medications. There are novel mechanisms or new medications within the same class or new classes that are coming out, which I hope the more tools the better. From a provider standpoint, in having the ability to use a medication that has slightly different way of working, so it might work for a particular patient, as well as just increasing the level of competition. And until then, I do want to take a conservative approach because at least as a provider, I know that I have a lot of different options. It's not a GLP-1 or bust. There are so many other classes of medications that we can use in the short term or long term that not only can provide that glucose control, but can also protect the heart, protect the kidneys, those types of things. I think we have a lot of tools. And as long as we work with our patient to really make sure everything is safe, I think, in several years, there will be a light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll have even more opportunities to really take care of type 2 diabetes and prevent it from really ruling our lives or leading to any complications.
I hate to see this. I've seen a lot of comments, kind of infighting, right, between people who are relying on these medications for obesity, people who are using them for diabetes, people who aren't using them at all but feel like they need to have an opinion. That's probably the biggest group, is that third group. Can you talk a little bit about your opinion on that and your patients with obesity?
Yeah, so this can be really challenging. And I wish there didn't have to be a fight. I mean, everyone has, our ultimate goal here is the health of the individual. And, whether we have type 2 diabetes or we have obesity, one of the number one complications that can occur is cardiovascular disease or cardiometabolic disease. And that's what we're trying to prevent. So depending on our severity of either obesity or type 2 diabetes, we may be at higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease than the other. So we may be at higher risk of developing that if we were to not have that medication. There was a recent publication, an editorial by Ezekiel Emanuel, who is at Penn Bioethics Center, about what is the ethics of giving a medication towards one particular patient versus another. And should we create a tier of, somebody who has uncontrolled type 2 diabetes, they should preferentially have this medication compared to somebody who has, maybe class 1 obesity with no metabolic complications of their underlying obesity. And I think that has some merits to it. However, in the United States, especially, that is infeasible to implement with our current broken healthcare system. What I try to do is I look at the patient in front of me and I try to take care of that patient the best as possible. And hopefully maybe at the macroeconomic scale or a public health policy scale, we can come up with something, fair and equitable.
It's interesting to me that it's one of the few health conditions where people who don't have it feel like they have an opinion, weight and type 2 diabetes. Why'd you become an endocrinologist?
Great question. So, I was always interested in endocrinology as well as cardiology. They both have cool kind of feedback loops, thinking about hormone production and how it might be increased in one way or decreased in the other. And I always found that really interesting. And I chose endocrinology mainly because I didn't have to be in the ICU. I didn't have to deal with the intensive care unit. And however, now I've kind of gone back to being at the intersection between endocrinology and cardiology or preventative cardiology. Because I mean, more and more we're seeing that these different disease states are more alike than they are different, especially when it comes to preventing that cardiovascular or cardiometabolic disease. I think it's really exciting that nephrology, endocrinology, cardiology, they can't exist in silos anymore because we have treatments, one of which is the GLP-1s that benefit all these disease systems. And so we really have to think about everything in a collective rather than in that specific subspecialty or specific silo.
Well, I appreciate it. I know we don't have enough endocrinologists, so you've got to have a super busy day, and I appreciate you taking some time out of it to talk to us. But thank you. Great advice here. Really good stuff. I hope you come back and talk with us again. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
I'm going to link up information in the show notes about much of what we spoke about, including that tracker I mentioned in the introduction, where you can use that to try to find this medication. If you have tips or tricks, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me, stacy@diabetes-connections.com, or ping me on social. On Instagram and LinkedIn, I'm just Stacey Sims. On Facebook and Threads, I am Diabetes Connections. I'm not really on Twitter anymore, and I do not use TikTok. So that's where you can find me. But I would love to hear from you. Tell me your stories. Let me know how this is going, and we'll see, what we can find out together. In the meantime, please take a moment, if you like this show, to share it with somebody in the diabetes community. Word of mouth is the best way to grow a show like this, and I'd really love to get this information out to as many people as we can to help them navigate this nonsense. All right, thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.